In the ancient texts preserved in Egyptian caves, there is something that does not fit the story we know about the origins of Christianity. Gnostic records speak of a practice completely different from traditional prayer, something called the Call of the Monad. Why were these documents hidden for centuries? And what was so dangerous about this form of spiritual connection that it needed to be erased from the collective memory? If you have not yet subscribed to the channel, take the opportunity now so as not to lose our upcoming documentaries on forgotten histories. Warning: this documentary uses AI-generated images for illustrative purposes. Although the visuals are synthetic, the content is the fruit of rigorous research based on real historical and scientific sources. Sources in the description. In a late copy of the Gospel of John, we find a strange phrase that went unnoticed by many. Before resurrecting Lazarus, Jesus says something peculiar. "Father, I thank thee that thou hast heard me." Notice the verb tense. He is not asking. He is thanking for something that has already happened, as if the circuit were already closed even before the command. Some ancient manuscripts suggest that this was not a common prayer, but what the Gnostics called alignment with the source. Try to follow this idea. If you grew up in a Christian tradition, you probably learned to pray as one who makes a request. If it be thy will, please, I humbly implore. The structure always places you in an inferior position, waiting for something or someone to decide for you. But what if this was not the original practice? What if there was a deliberate change in the way people connected with the divine? In the texts of Nag Hammadi, discovered by chance in 1945 in Egypt, we find a very different version of this story. These were documents that had remained buried for more than 1,500 years. When they were translated, they revealed a primitive Christian tradition that the institutional church had fought with full force. Among these texts, there are detailed descriptions of what they called direct knowledge, a form of accessing divinity that did not depend on intermediaries. Look at this interesting detail. In the Gospel of Philip, one of these preserved texts, there is a passage that says the world came about through an error. It is not a small idea. If the physical world is the result of a mistake, then the rules of this world are also questionable. And what if the very power structures that taught us to obey are part of this defective system? The Gnostics had a very specific cosmology about this. They spoke of something called the monad, the absolute unity prior to any creation. It was not a character god sitting on a throne, judging and deciding. It was more like the primordial consciousness, the source of everything. And here's the point that bothered so much. They believed that some humans carried a spark of this same substance, a spark of the monad itself. Think with me. If you have within yourself a piece of the original source, the dynamic changes completely. It is no longer a question of asking permission from a distant being. It is a question of remembering who you really are. It is activating something that was already there, waiting to be recognized. The texts speak of this as gnosis, direct knowledge, not based on faith or belief, but on experience. Now, visualize how this worked in practice. Instead of bending the knees and imploring, the person entered a state of alignment with this superior identity. They recognized the connection, adjusted the internal frequency, and then commanded. Not as a human ego, but as a representative of the source itself. This was what the archons, or the forces that governed the lower system, feared most. But who were these archons? In the ancient manuscripts, they are not described as fantasy demons. They are more like cosmic governors, administrators of an imperfect system. Today, perhaps we could understand them as the very mechanisms of control: fear, guilt, the sensation of scarcity, chronic anxiety. Everything that keeps human consciousness in a state of amnesia regarding its true nature. Notice how interesting this is. If you teach someone to always ask, never to command, you keep that person in a position of eternal dependency. They never question the system because they believe they have no authority to do so. Prayer as supplication would be, then, a technology of control. A way to keep people psychologically submissive, always waiting for someone else to solve their problems. The Gnostic texts suggest that Jesus taught exactly the opposite of this. In several preserved passages, he speaks about awakening to what already exists inside people. In the Gospel of Thomas, there is a phrase that says, "If you bring forth what is within you, what you bring forth will save you. If you do not bring forth what is within you, what you do not bring forth will destroy you." It does not sound like the discourse of someone encouraging external dependency. But then, how did this transformation happen? How did a tradition of inner empowerment turn into a system of external obedience? The clues are in the documents of the era themselves. Irenaeus of Lyons, one of the first church fathers, wrote extensively against the Gnostics in the 2nd century. He accused them of arrogance, of thinking themselves equal to God. But perhaps this arrogance was precisely what made them dangerous to a system that needed obedient faithful. Try to imagine the practical difference. In a community where people believed they had direct access to the source, who would need a priest to interpret the divine will? Who would pay tithes to an institution that promised to intermediate something that you yourself could access? The economy of salvation would collapse. And there was more. The Gnostics spoke of 3 types of people: the Hilics, completely bound to matter; the Psychics, who could have faith and follow moral rules; and the Pneumatics, who carried the active spark and could remember their origin. This classification created a hierarchy based on consciousness, not on obedience to external authorities. It was a silent revolution. In the preserved accounts of how the call of the monad worked, we find very specific descriptions. It was not a matter of reciting beautiful words or following elaborate rituals. It was about reaching a particular internal state. Mental silence, descent to the center of the chest, recognition of the already existing connection, and then, from that alignment, the command emerged natural and definitive. Look at this curious parallel. In the text, there is much talk about the heart as a generator and the brain as a processor. The practice was not to fight against thoughts, but simply to disengage from the mental noise. When the person found this place of internal quietude, something changed in the quality of the intention. It was no longer a desperate request. It was a report of alignment. But here enters a part that is perhaps the most disturbing of this whole story. Why were texts so ancient and apparently legitimate considered heretical? Why did the primitive church invest so much effort in combating these ideas? The letters of Irenaeus show an almost desperate concern to delegitimize any form of Christianity that did not depend on the ecclesiastical structure. And look at what interesting timing. Precisely in the period when Christianity was becoming the official religion of the Roman Empire, 4th century onwards, these Gnostic traditions were being systematically eliminated. The texts were burned, the practitioners persecuted, the communities dispersed. As if there were an urgency to establish a unique and controllable version of the Christian message. Because that is what happens when you standardize spiritual tradition. You need to eliminate the variations that do not serve the political purpose. If the goal is to create a mass religion that sustains an empire, you cannot allow traditions that encourage people to question any and all authority, including your own. But some vestiges survived. In marginal notes of manuscripts copied by monks throughout the centuries, in oral traditions preserved by isolated communities, in symbols and practices that were transmitted in a disguised manner, as if there were a subterranean current of knowledge that resisted all attempts at eradication. And this knowledge had to do with something very simple and, at the same time, revolutionary. The idea that each person carries within themselves a spiritual authority that does not depend on external validation, that the connection with the divine is direct, immediate, and accessible, that there is no need for intermediaries when you recognize your own origin. Now, before we continue exploring how this practice really worked, there is something else that needs to be clarified about the documents that survived. Because not everything we find in Nag Hammadi was about individual empowerment. Some texts also speak of cosmic hierarchies, of secret knowledge that only some could access, of a complexity that goes far beyond the simple opposition between supplication and command. And it is precisely in this complexity that the true mystery of this lost tradition dwells. Remember that question about the text that survived in a fragmented form? Well, when you start to join these dispersed pieces, a pattern emerges that goes far beyond the simple difference between asking and commanding. There are indications that the call of the monad was part of a complete system of understanding about how reality actually works and why it seems so resistant to our attempts at change. In the preserved manuscripts of the Gospel of Philip, we find a curious description regarding miracles. The text suggests that healing, multiplying loaves, or calming storms were not exceptions to natural laws, they were corrections. As if the reality we experience were a distorted version of something more fundamental, and the so-called miracles were moments in which this distortion was temporarily undone. Think with me on this logic. If the material world is really an imperfect copy, as the Gnostics said, then disease, scarcity, and chaos would not be absolute laws. They would be programming defects, and someone with access to the source code could make punctual corrections. Not by magic, but by technical authority. This completely changes how we understand what happened when Jesus operated. He was not a special being breaking rules to impress the masses. He was someone who had remembered how the system really worked before being corrupted. And, more importantly, he was teaching others to do the same thing. In the Apocryphon of John, there is a detailed cosmology about this question of the original distortion. The text speaks of a figure called the Demiurge, literally artificer or constructor, who would have created the material cosmos as an imperfect imitation of the true world. It was not pure evil, but incompetence. Like a junior programmer trying to replicate a complex system he does not completely understand. Now, look how interesting. If you accept this premise, several theological problems resolve themselves at once. Why is there so much suffering if God is good? Because the God that the majority of people worship is not the true source. He is the defective administrator of the local system. The monad, the real unity, is beyond all this. This distinction appears in a disguised form even in the canonical texts. In the Gospel of John, Jesus speaks repeatedly about my Father in a way that suggests a direct, unmediated relationship. He does not refer to the God of the Old Testament in the same manner as the other characters, as if he were speaking of a superior instance in the cosmic hierarchy. And here enters a detail that went unnoticed for centuries. In the Gnostic texts, there are descriptions of three fundamental types of human consciousness. The hylix, completely identified, with the body and material needs. The psychics, capable of having faith and following moral rules, but still dependent on external authorities. And the pneumatics, who carry the active spark of the monad. Notice that this is not a hierarchy of moral value, but of compatibility with different frequencies of information. A hylix cannot process pneumatic instructions in the same way that an AM radio cannot capture FM signals. It is not a deficiency, it is technical incompatibility. This explains why the call of the monad did not work for everyone, regardless of effort or sincerity. It was not as much a question of merit or moral purity. It was a question of having the internal equipment necessary to establish the connection. And according to the text, not everyone was born with this equipment activated. But there was one more layer to this question. Some late manuscripts suggest that this difference between types of consciousness was not fixed, that a psychic could, under certain conditions, awaken the pneumatic spark. It was this that made the Gnostic teachings truly dangerous. They offered a technology of transformation of human nature itself. In the preserved accounts regarding specific practices, we find very detailed descriptions of the process. First, it was necessary to recognize the difference between the constant mental noise and the underlying quietude. The texts speak about descending to the heart, not as a romantic metaphor, but as a precise anatomical location. The center of the chest as an access point to the vertical connection. Try to follow this sequence. The person entered into internal silence, not fighting against thoughts, but simply disengaging from them, like leaving a noisy room for a silent room. In this state of quietude, something changed in the quality of attention. Instead of being dispersed in daily worries, it concentrated in a single direction, upwards, towards the source. And then came the recognition. Not a belief or hope, but a direct knowledge that the connection was always there. Like remembering something you had forgotten, but that never really disappeared. The texts call this anamnesis, literally non-forgetting. From this point, the command emerged naturally, not as personal will, but as an expression of the monad itself through that specific human channel. That is why it was so effective. There was no internal resistance, there was no doubt, there was no separation between who asked and who answered. It was the source commanding its own creation. But look at this crucial detail that appears in several texts. After the command, a complete detachment from the result was necessary. Looking back, checking if it worked, trying to repeat the experience. All this reactivated the old mental code. It was as if the efficacy depended on a paradox. You needed to have total certainty at the moment of the command, but total indifference after it. This explains why so many people who tried to reproduce these practices throughout the centuries failed. They took the technique, but did not understand the cosmology behind it. They tried to use the Gnostic method with the traditional Christian mentality, asking the God of the system, waiting for external approval, checking results with anxiety. And there was another problem. Most of the texts that survived are fragmentary. Incomplete excerpts, translated multiple times, copied by scribes who did not always understand the original context. It is like trying to reconstitute a complex recipe from dispersed ingredients and ambiguous instructions. But some clearer vestiges survived in unexpected places. In later Christian contemplative traditions, like the Desert Fathers of the 3rd and 4th centuries, they spoke of hesychiaou, inner quietude, and of a form of prayer that transcended words. They did not use the Gnostic vocabulary, but the structure of the practice was recognizable. In the Orthodox tradition, something called the prayer of the heart developed, where the person repeated a simple phrase until it became automatic and the mind could rest in a deeper quietude. It was a domesticated version of the original Gnostic technology, adapted to function within the doctrinal limits accepted by the Church. But even in these safe versions, there were moments when experienced practitioners reported experiences that sounded suspiciously familiar. States of absolute certainty. Internal commands that resulted in external changes. Sensations of being connected directly with the source, without intermediaries. The issue is that these accounts were carefully filtered before becoming public. Anything that sounded too arrogant, that suggested independent spiritual authority, that questioned the need for ecclesiastical hierarchy, all this was edited or suppressed. What reached us was the domesticated version, safe for mass consumption. And look at the irony. While the Church fiercely combated any trace of Christian Gnosticism, other traditions preserved similar elements without problems. In Alexandrian Hermeticism, in Neoplatonic philosophy, in certain currents of mystical Judaism, as if knowledge were water, you can block a channel, but it finds other paths. This raises a disturbing question about the very nature of what was suppressed. Could it be that the real problem was not the Gnostic heresy, but the fact that it worked? Could it be that texts were burned and people were persecuted, not because they taught lies, but because they taught truths that made certain power structures obsolete? Because that is what happens when you offer people a technology of direct access to the divine. They stop needing you, they stop paying, they stop obeying, they stop being afraid. And a system based on the psychological dependency of the faithful cannot survive this type of autonomy. But perhaps the most disquieting aspect of this whole story is the possibility that this suppression was not completely successful. That fragments of the original technology are still around, disguised in apparently innocuous traditions, in meditation practices, in visualization techniques, in modern therapeutic methods that work with altered states of consciousness. And what if what we call today manifestation or law of attraction are distorted echoes of the call of the monad? Commercialized and simplified versions of something that was originally much deeper and more powerful? As if someone had found pieces of an ancient technical manual and tried to sell a version for beginners? The difference would be in the cosmological foundations. Most modern approaches still operate within the paradigm of disguised supplication. You ask the universe, visualize what you want, wait for something external to organize circumstances in your favor. It is an improved version of traditional prayer, but still based on the separation between who asks and who answers. The original Gnostic technology was different. It started from the principle that there is no separation, that the human spark and the cosmic monad are of the same substance, that the command does not go out and come back transformed. It is realized in the very act of being pronounced, because it is the source speaking with itself through one of its focal points of consciousness. But to what extent can we trust these reconstitutions? To what extent are we really rescuing ancient knowledge or just projecting our contemporary desires onto a tradition we barely understand? It is a question that remains without a definitive answer because the very documents that could clarify these questions were systematically destroyed. What we know with more certainty is that there was a drastic change in the way Christianity was practiced between the first centuries and what established itself as official orthodoxy, and that this change was not accidental or evolutionary. It was the result of conscious political decisions taken by people with specific interests in mind. Official history tells us that this was necessary to protect the purity of the doctrine against heretical distortions. But when you examine the Gnostic texts themselves, not the caricatures made by their opponents, you find a sophisticated, coherent, and, at least in theory, verifiable tradition in direct experience. And this verifiability is perhaps the most crucial point of all, because in the end, it does not matter how many documents were burned or how many people were persecuted. If the technology was real, if there really existed an effective way to establish direct connection with the source, then this possibility remains available. Hidden, perhaps, disguised, certainly, but not eliminated. The question that remains is whether we are still capable of distinguishing between the original version and the imitations that emerged throughout the centuries. If we still have the keys to decipher the fragments that survived, or if after so many centuries of conditioning for external dependency, we have lost the capacity to recognize our own spiritual authority when it presents itself.